Yeah.
No, that's a cool thought. Okay, let's get back on track. Man.
Uh, all right.
Well,
Actually,
these things can just take you so many places. This is why a good story, whether it's a fairy tale or whether it's a parable, you can just kind of run with it once you really dig into the meaning behind it. And so, anyway,
yeah,
get us back
yeah.
on track here.
All right. So you ready to kick off season 4?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. Parables.
Yeah.
I mean, we kind of introduced it last week, but I really got into it this week, and I'm pumped. I'm pumped. There's a lot more there than I kind of thought maybe at the beginning, but yeah, we'll jump right into it.
Yeah. And so we will start off today by talking about the parables of the coming kingdom. We're going to do a little bit of explanation here, probably about why we're doing this series. But I wanted to start out with an important question, get your feedback as we launch this series, is what did you think about the Stranger Things season finale?
Yeah,
We got to
hey, it
get
was
the
great.
important stuff.
Yeah, I know. No, I thought it was good. It was a little mixed. I don't know. Most people generally liked it online. There's a little bit of a mixed review, but I'll tell you what is interesting about Stranger Things is that because we're doing fairy tales and because we're doing this podcast and what we do, it really does change the way I watch shows like that. You know, kind of supernatural sci-fi.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, there's aspects of it that I'm thinking, oh, I don't know, and I wish I could think of an example. I wish it had it right at hand, but there were just aspects of it that I remember thinking, understanding the mythical side of what they were trying to portray, as opposed to just sit down and take the ride that they want to take you on, you know.
Yeah, I found myself doing that as well. In the moment, it was hard because, the last episode was, like 2.5 hours or something like that.
Yeah, there's a lot
But
going on,
I found
too.
myself, trying to think, okay, what does this represent? What does the wormhole represent? What is the crashing together of two worlds? I'd have to go back and watch it, but I don't know. My 2 cents on it was I actually liked season 5. There was a season there I didn't really like. I didn't know what the point of it all was. Yeah, I enjoyed season 5.
Yeah, I think it was last
I
season
thought the
fell
last,
flat a little bit.
Yeah, where they were in California, and I was just like, I don't even know what the point of all this is, besides
Right.
to milk more episodes. Yeah, the last 30, 45 minutes got a little long and drawn out, but understandable. The whole show was wrapping up, so.
Well, yeah, because when they actually defeated, was it the Demogorgon, or what was the big? I forget the main guy's name. Vecna. When they actually defeated Vecna, I'm like, man, we're halfway through this episode. Where are we going with this now? You know? But
that's it. It's a wrap.
Yeah, then that was it. But I appreciated the whole follow up and that they didn't just pull the plug on it and say, okay, that's that. The world's been saved. That they actually followed up with them months later and kind of gave their what are they doing now type of scenes that we come to expect when we've been holding on to something for 5 seasons. And it's more than 5 seasons. I mean, it's only 5 seasons, but it was filmed over like 7 years, right? Because didn't they skip a year or two?
Yeah.
I forget.
Yeah.
So, I mean, all these kids have grown up and we got to see all of them get so much older. And so a lot of the flashback scenes, that was fun. I thought it was pretty good as far as series finales go.
Yeah, it wasn't bad. It was funny because my wife and I were talking about it. Some of the actors were like 24, 25. I can't remember the guy's name, but one of them he was like 34 years old right now.
Oh, really?
The guy with the nice hair,
Oh, yeah.
Can't remember
Harrington.
his name, but
yeah.
Harrington, yeah. He's like 34 years old.
Golly,
so,
no, I didn't
and you're
realize
still
that.
supposed to believe that he's, 19 years old, 1 year removed out of high school or something like that.
Oh,
anyway,
yeah. No, that's Hollywood for you.
Anyway, yeah, we hadn't talked about it, so I just wanted to get your take on that. So, all right, so let's start actually talking about the parables of Jesus now instead of Stranger Things. But we actually started thinking about this as kind of a continuation of our series on ancient stories, which is where we did fairy tales. And I don't know, I don't think we'll call it ancient stories, but it's along the same lines in that we want to explore these stories, and parables certainly fall into that category, right from that aspect of what's the deeper meaning? What's the symbolism embedded in all of these stories? Right? Yeah, so that's what we're going to do with this. One of the challenges, I think I mentioned this in the opening episode, was I found myself thinking, well, they're pretty self-explanatory. You've heard all these taught in church before. There are some, like we're going to cover today, where Jesus actually says, hey, here's what this parable means.
Right.
And I found myself thinking, well, okay, what is there for us to talk about? But the more you and I batted some ideas around, man, there's a lot of depth in these parables.
Yeah, there's a lot there, and we'll jump into it because one of the things that surprised me, I had that same thought that you did is, well, how many sermons have we heard about the sower and the seed, and
Yeah.
what are we going to bring that's new to the table? But really, that kind of mythical thinking that we've gotten accustomed to is really, really helpful, especially in this one. So I think there's actually a lot there that I'd never really realized.
Well, you brought up this idea of reading it symbolically. I read this, I forget where I read it, but I did write it down. But part of our, we always talk about the rational, scientific, reductionistic worldview that we all live in today for
Yeah.
the most part. And one of the things that's done with stories is it looks at the moral of the story as the most important part, right? So once you get the moral of the story, you don't need the story anymore. You just
Right.
have the principle.
Right.
And you can think a lot of ways where that's been the case. You read your kid a fairy tale and say, here's the moral of the story. Once you got that down, you don't need to read fairy tales anymore, right?
Right.
And we do
Right.
this sometimes with parables, but to recapture this idea of a symbolic worldview or an ancient worldview, as we've talked about it, you can't throw the story away, right? Because there's so much more embedded in it than that simple moral truth. That's
Right.
important. Sorry, I've got a little bit of a cold. It's important, but you can't throw the story away, right?
Right. Right. Once you reduce a story to the lesson or the moral, you've lost half of its power. Right. And yeah,
Yeah.
maybe a good place to start is kind of just remember that this is a world where illiteracy was the norm. And not because people were unintelligent or anything, but there was no easy way to distribute written information. This is long before printing presses or mass texts of any type, right? And so ideas didn't spread on paper, they spread through voice, right? And that's why you had a town crier running through villages announcing the news, And so in a world like that, if you wanted an idea to spread, if you wanted it to go viral, right, it had to be packaged in a way that was memorable or portable or easy to retell from one town to the next. And so that's kind of the bottom layer of why use parables. And we'll get in and find out that there's a lot more to unpack when why Jesus told stories with parables. We'll get into that in here in a second. But just on the very surface level, that's why it was so necessary to package these stories in the oral tradition so it could go from town to town. But once you boil it down to a lesson, then man, you've lost the power of the story to communicate the lesson. You may have the lesson, but it doesn't have the communication power that it originally had when it's attached to the story.
And you've also boiled a story down to one lesson as opposed to many, many lessons, which I hope we bring out in this series.
Yeah.
So we're going to be in Matthew chapter 13 today. Do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, just let me add that it really is, we really are trying to think about the way the ancients viewed these things, because modern minds, they want to, like you said, they want to boil down and pull out the moral of the story so they can move on away from the fairy tale part of it or the parable part of it. But it's just really important to understand how modern minds, we want conclusions, and ancient minds wanted patterns. You know what I'm saying? The modern mind kind of wants to boil it down to a propositional truth, a scientific truth, or something like that, right? And that's fine, but you just have to understand that propositional truth tells you what is true, while parables train you to recognize what is true. Do you see the difference?
Yeah.
And so anyway, so I just kind of want to point that out as we get started, that obviously parables are a different way of communicating truth, but it's more like it's what's embedded in it is how to recognize the pattern of truth, as opposed to simply saying, the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not do this, thou shalt not do that, right? And so it's trying to help you understand patterns.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
All right, like I said, we're going to be in Matthew chapter 13 today, I think, for all of these. But it's interesting that in the middle of Matthew chapter 13, we're talking about, well, why are we talking about parables? Well, Jesus was asked this question directly. So the disciples came to him in Matthew chapter 13, verse 10, and they said, why do you speak to them in parables? Which tells you that it wasn't just the norm back then,
Yeah, they kind of
because
took
the
issue with it
disciples were,
themselves. Yeah.
yeah, why are you doing this? And so Jesus answers, to you has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. So you kind of see that duality in why Jesus says, here's why I talk in parables, because to those who are open, to his disciples, to those who are paying attention, right, he says, you will understand what I'm saying. But to those who don't want to hear it, who aren't tracking with me, who aren't open, right, it's just going to confuse them. And you were, right before we hit record, you were talking about this idea of parables have a way of attacking something, but kind of in this vague form where the people he's attacking or the institutions that are being attacked, they're kind of like, was that directed at me? Like,
did he just say what I think he said?
Yeah,
because I've got a problem with that. But the moments pass them by. It's almost like he's not being direct with it, and so it takes him a while to catch up, right?
Yeah. So I just thought that was interesting that even in the middle of all this, his disciples say, well, Jesus, why are you telling these stories? Why can't you just lay out the law, right?
Yeah, give it
Or
to me
something
straight.
like
Why?
that.
And they probably thought he was like talking in riddles. But you have to think about the religious environment that Jesus was in. The Pharisees didn't really speak in parables or stories. They spoke in legalistic verbiage that stemmed from Levitical law, right? Which is exactly what happens when information is chiseled into stone, right? So parables don't really bypass reason. They bypass the defensiveness that is built up when you have this legalistic structure. And that's what made Jesus' way of speaking so disruptive, is that he communicated ideas in a form that was less likely to get hijacked into rigid ideology. And that's why I think he used the parable structure.
Yeah. Just as you said that, I'm thinking he's actually elevating all the legal codes that were being taught,
right,
to more of a virtuous way of living, to understanding the world, knowing that if you did all those things, you probably were going to keep all of these legal codes. But more importantly, you understood the reason why they were there and the principle they were trying to communicate. And so if you understood the parable, I think you became a good citizen of Israel, almost de facto, right? Instead of towing the line of, am I breaking the law here? Am I breaking the law here? And look, that's what Jesus does a lot of times. He goes around and says, look, I don't care what the law says. I'm telling you to live this way, right?
Right.
And so parables are a way to do that.
And it's just kind of the spirit of the law as opposed to the law itself, because in this day and time, the Pharisees had taken the law and extrapolated it out to where you don't pick heads of wheat on Sunday, and like these real strict interpretations of the Levitical law. And I just think it's interesting that they were so rigid in the way they saw the law that was handed down to them. The only way it can grow and adapt is to become more and more strict. Do you know what I'm saying? I mean, you're not going to go back to the original Mosaic law and say, well, that was then and this is now, and we don't really have to apply such a strict interpretation to that. Really, all it can do is get more and more restrictive and strict as time moves on. And therefore, well, if you're supposed to honor the Sabbath, then that means that nobody does any work, and that means you can't saddle up your horse or your donkey, and that means that, you know what I mean? It just kept getting more and more layered until it became such a restrictive structure. And Jesus talked about that, the weight of the law that they're putting on people. Oh, was that Paul?
No, Jesus talked about that too.
Yeah. The weight of the law that we're putting on the people. And that's the only way that it can really progress, if you have the law written, chiseled in stone. And so the parables kind of circumvented that a lot.
Yeah. All right, so let's jump in. We're going to talk about several parables today. Like I said, they're all in Matthew chapter 13. But we've kind of grouped these as the inbreaking of God's kingdom. And we talked about this on an episode a while ago, where we kept running into the phrase, the kingdom of heaven is like,
Right.
right? So this is an opportunity to maybe revisit, all right, what was he saying when he says the kingdom of heaven is like this and like that, right? Because he's trying to describe something that they really don't have a good experience of. So
Right.
we're going to talk about these today, Matthew chapter 13. We're going to start with, I'm sure, a familiar one, the parable of the sower. And I guess we'll start by just letting people listen to it, and then you and I will come back and start picking it apart.
Yeah, it sounds good.
Then he told them many things in parables, saying, A farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places, where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly, because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Still other seed fell on good soil, where it produced a crop, 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. Whoever has ears, let them hear.
Okay, so I guess we'll start just like we always start our fairy tales and our myths, and we have a sower, we have seed, we have different types of ground. Let's start off with the easy stuff. What does a sower represent? What is the seed? Where are you going to take this?
Well, one thing that I'll start out with because I asked the question, who is the sower? And it talks about the seed is the gospel, so we'll get to that. But it occurred to me that Jesus is being a bit self-referential here, because ultimately, in the beginning, Jesus is the one sowing the seed, right?
Right.
And I guess I don't know, you can jump in. I never really thought of it that way before, that Jesus is actually talking about himself launching this ministry where he's going to go around talking about repent for the kingdom of heaven is near. Which,
Yeah, it's a little veiled to the listeners at the time who are listening to it in real time. We obviously look back and draw that conclusion. But do you think that the listeners at the time would have all picked up on that?
well, it's the nature of parables again. I think there would have been some who would have saying, okay, he's talking about a random guy sowing seeds. He's talking about the kingdom of heaven. But I think others would have said, wait, I think he's actually talking about himself. And
Yeah.
why it's interesting to me is because he talks about how some seed fell on rocky soil, right? We have the types of soil on the path and rocky soil and all that. And I don't know, in a way, he's kind of aware his message isn't going to land on everyone. And there's actually going to be very few that get it. And it's one thing for me
Yeah.
to say, well, I've got to be faithful and sow the seeds. I don't know. That was just my first thought. It's another thing to see that Jesus actually was referring to himself ultimately about, yeah, some people are going to reject it, others aren't. I have to be faithful sowing the seeds, this message of the kingdom of heaven, right?
Yeah. And it's also interesting, kind of the detachment of the sower. I mean, it kind of presents this image of a guy just wandering through the countryside
Yeah.
randomly, Johnny Appleseed, tossing seeds up in the air, and some of it's going to land on the path, some of it's going to land on rocky soil, which is interesting because I'm sure farmers at the time are probably thinking, well, why in the world are you throwing seeds on a road? You know what I mean? It's
Right.
like
Yeah.
let's cultivate the ground first. Let's be a little bit more efficient with our process here. It's probably driving some farmers crazy.
Yeah, you obviously don't know how to plan a field if that's what you're saying. But that's kind of the picture I had of this, it's just like you said, Johnny Appleseed just going around scattering seeds, right? And some of it just falls where it will. But no, I think Jesus is being intentional about, as he goes along, he's sowing the seeds, and we're to do the same. And it's not about planting a field, so to speak. It's about talking about the kingdom of God wherever you go. And you don't always have the choice of what kind of soil you're putting the
Right.
seeds in, if that makes sense. Right?
Well, this plays into the idea of the parable itself. It's going to go out to a group of people. There are instances where Jesus sat down one-on-one and communicated with somebody a lot more directly because this is a one-on-one situation. But when you're talking to groups of people, the very nature of that is that we're scattering seed. We're putting bits of information about reality embedded in the story. Some of you are going to hear it, some of you aren't. And so the very nature of the story itself is just to toss, it's like a bucket of water, just toss it out there. Some people are going to get soaked and some people, the water's not going to hit. But it's sort of the random nature of the spoken word to begin with, as opposed to go back, I'm going to keep going back to this, as opposed to the rigid, chiseled law that had created the religious culture of the time.
Yeah, so I think even as Jesus is telling the story, that's what he's doing. He is actually becoming the sower, right?
Yeah.
And the ground is everyone listening. Some are going to get it, some aren't.
Right.
And he understood that as he was teaching. I don't know, I just thought that was neat. So that's
I
the
think
sower. And obviously the next thing is the seed. Now you and I, we can talk a lot about this, but we had a lot of conversations earlier, yesterday, I think we were talking on the phone, about this idea of a seed. What a huge metaphor that is.
Yeah, it's such a great image of the gospel because it's not a fully formed concept, right? It's an idea that's meant to grow and evolve. And it's another image that kind of pushes back at the rigid absolutism of the religious system of his day. And honestly, it's a warning to the modern church that if we become too inflexible, we can cut ourselves off from growth, right? Living things don't grow well in rigid containers. And so, I think he's kind of, that image of the seed really resonated with me on a deeper level this time that I read it, because I'm really trying to figure out, well, what's the difference between, a seed? It's like a seed is this organic thing, unlike a diamond or a bar of gold, right? That has a fixed value within the thing itself, like it's static. You know what I mean? A seed is more like potential, unrealized value, something like that. But it has to be properly integrated into fertile soil in order to bear the potential.
Right, yeah. Yeah, the seed is only the potential, but it contains all the potential that's needed.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so it comes in this little, and we're going to do this throughout, but it starts to tie into some other parables we're going to look at. It's this little insignificant thing, but that thing contains all the potential, in this case, for the kingdom of heaven to grow and flourish, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
The other thing I think that's interesting is when you talk about the seed, being organic, in the ancient times, and even sometimes today, but not many of us go plow a field today. But what you would do, especially in the Middle East, is you had to clear the field of rocks, right? And so the seed is that living thing as opposed to the rock. But there's also the clearing of the field, and then the rocks often become the boundary.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And you see this everywhere. You see it in Greece, and you see it in the Middle East.
Right.
And so, I don't know, there's something, I don't quite know what to do with that, but we'll talk about the rocky soil here. I'm getting ahead of myself maybe. But I just wanted to point out that, the seed is that organic living thing as opposed to the rock, which is fixed, and it actually acts as a boundary sometimes.
Yeah.
But that's not the thing. That's not the point of the field.
Well, the rock is it provides a foundation. It's rigid, right? Rigidity creates stability, but it kills growth. Seeds need a living soil. And so, again, up until this point, we've got this rigidity. We've got this solid foundation that we can point to. And Jesus is coming along and saying, okay, the kingdom of heaven's close, but it's going to be more like a seed and less like the rigid foundation rock that provides stability.
Yeah, and you could even see it where some thought Jesus was going to be like a military leader and overthrow Rome and set up his kingdom. Not that you would pick up on this, but if you were truly listening, you might think, no, that's not what a seed does, right?
Right.
He's just planting the potential, and it's going to take time to develop, and it's not going to be a giant overthrow of Rome.
And I'd have to think about your concept about you take the rocks and build the boundary. I like that. I think there's something there. I don't know. We'll have to let the listeners run with that one, because there is something to that, because you're exactly right. As you plow up, you come across these field stones, and you don't just throw it in the river. You take those field stones as like, well, I'll build my wall with that. So there is something about walling in a fertile soil, but you still need both things. You need the boundary.
Yeah.
You need You need it laid out, in black and white. Here's the boundary, but in the middle, you've got this more organic phenomenon taking place that enables growth.
Well, you can think of the law as the boundary, right?
Yeah.
All those rocks piled, forming a boundary, forming a safe space where people can thrive, basically.
Right.
But if you just build the boundary and say, okay, here's an empty patch of dirt, go thrive, right? What's it missing? It's missing the life. It's missing the seed. And so I think, to really get deep into this, I think maybe Jesus is actually comparing the law to kind of the rocks that form the boundary. But what's missing is the seed. It's the life, right? It's the organic thing that you have to nurture and step back and just watch what it does. But you don't just clear a field and then pile rocks up and say, there we go. There's life.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, you're right.
So it's something like that. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I go to him telling Peter that calling him the rock and saying, on your foundation, I'm going to build the church. So there's some kind of recognition about we need foundations in our culture. We need our foundations in life. But at the same time, it's in those rigid foundations, you're not going to have organic growth. And I think that I kind of really, really think that that's one of the aspects of this parable that it communicated to me this particular time that I read it. As we kind of dug in that way, I was like, yeah, I think he's pushing back at the rigid religious structure of the time. Because again, the details of a story matter. We say that every time we go through these. Why wouldn't it be like a diamond that you found in the ground? Why wouldn't it be like, it's the gospel, the kingdom of God is valuable like a bar of gold or a big chunk of gold? And I think that the fact that he used the seed metaphor pushes against that idea of we have this diamond of priceless worth. And it's like saying, no, that's not what I'm coming to do. I'm coming to plant seeds. I'm coming to start something that is going to organically grow and spread. And that's the metaphor he's fostering right now, as opposed to the rigid rock. I don't know.
Yeah. I think that's definitely there. All right, we got a bit ahead of ourselves, but so the idea is the sower goes around sowing seeds, and then we have these 4 types of soil, right?
Right.
So we have some fell on the path where it says the seeds were simply snatched up. The evil one snatches the seeds up. Rocky ground and thorns, and then good soil. So let's talk about these soils. The first one is the path. And I had the same thought you had earlier, which is, why the heck would you throw seeds on a path, right? But if you realize that this is what Jesus is doing, he is the sower, right? He's not planting a field per se. He's casting the seeds out, and some are just going to fall where they will. But what did you take of the meaning of this idea of the path? It's obviously the well-worn path. It's hard. Nothing's going to grow there.
Yeah, it's more than just, well, it's packed dirt and you can't take root. I think there's something to it, because a path is what you travel on, right? And it's something more akin to, you're unlikely to embrace a transformative idea when you're fixated on where everyone else is traveling. It's like when you're watching where everybody's going, right? Crowds are great for efficiency, but they're terrible for transformation. And that's why the gospel is described as a narrow path, right? You can't really discover something if everybody is already pointing to it, right? That's not a discovery. And so there's something about the gospel idea that says you need to leave the beaten path. You need to look where no one is looking and be willing to walk a different direction. It's something like that.
Yeah, we talk about how transformation takes place in the wilderness, right? Not the well-worn path.
Yeah, exactly.
So one of the things that occurred to me when we were thinking about the path is, I thought the path is social media, right?
What everybody's looking at.
It's what everyone's
you get your
looking
likes.
at.
Yeah, no, that's good.
Everyone's yelling at each other, right? Everyone's disagreeing. We say we're having a conversation, but we're not. We're just arguing back and forth, right? That's not fertile soil for transformation to take place.
Yeah. And see, I was going to say the thorns are social media.
The thorns. Okay, I could see that too.
We go either way
but
with
it did
that.
said
Social media is definitely in here, though. We're gonna bang on that a little bit.
I'm sticking with the path. That's social media, but
no, there is something interesting about where everybody's at, where, because this is where you get your likes and where you get reinforced by everybody that says, hey, good job. And you know what I mean? So you're always searching for that And so there's something neat about that idea of the well-worn, beaten-down path that everybody's at. You're just not going to find transformation there. That's pretty good.
Well, and then he says that what happens is, the seeds just lay there. They can't actually embed in the soil. So it says the birds just come along and eat it. And to me, that describes social media too, is there's no real conversations to be had. It's just on to the next thing.
Yeah, did you go any depth about the birds?
No, I can't say that I did. Although here again, this is one of those parables where later, and we're going to get to this, the disciples say, what does this parable mean, right? So Jesus actually explains a little bit of this. And so he says the evil one, I
Right.
think he says later, the evil one comes in and snatches up the seed. So maybe the birds have something to do with like the evil one.
Yeah, in the fairy tales, if you have a bird, you have something that's of heaven coming down and snatching. So it does have that
Yeah.
image of something from above coming and snatching up the seed that can't take any root.
That's true.
Maybe there is a little bit of a dual meaning that obviously the path is where I see everybody going, and so I'm just going to be part of the herd, and you can't really there's no transformation in that. But also that aspect of something from above snatching the gospel idea. I don't know. I'd have to dig into that a little bit more, but I think there's something to that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that's why he maybe says the evil one comes and snatches it all away, when in the parable it was the birds, right? Yeah, it's that something that lives in the air that comes to the ground and won't let anything take root. Yeah, I think might be something there.
Well, I like your social media analogy because there is something about try to say something transformative on TikTok and then just look at the comments. I mean, all the top comments are going to say, you're a moron and
Yeah.
your ears are huge and what's the deal with what you're wearing? You know what I mean? They're all going to be snarky, and it does have this nice image of birds just picking away. The Alfred Hitchcock movie, just picking your eyes out, peck by peck, right? There does seem to be something like that going on in social media.
All right, so the next soil that seeds fall on is some fell on the rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow, but when the sun came up, the plants were scorched. So there's basically no depth of soil, right? Because
Yeah.
and we talked about this idea a little bit already, of that idea of the soil containing rock, that if you actually tended a field, that's one of the first things you do is you go pull all the rocks out.
Right. Yeah, a seed requires an organic medium, and rocks don't have any nutrients that foster growth. So when you have too many, it's something like when you have too many rigid absolutes in your thinking, then new ideas don't have any space to take root.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, and so what do the rocks represent? Maybe that's
so
the
it goes
question.
back to that idea then that the rocks could represent something like the legal code, right?
Yeah.
Like if your mind is full of the rules, there's just a bunch of rocks. There's no soil that's actually going to grow something new and transformative.
Right.
And there again, there is something there about those idea of the rocks serving as the boundary. But if you leave them in the field, then nothing's really going to grow. It's going to come up fast, and then it's just going to die because there's no soil there. The soil is too filled with all of the rules and the laws, and there's no real space for transformation. It's going to be something like that.
Yeah, all the rigid things that don't provide any nutrition. It's great for stability, but it doesn't provide nutrition for a seed to grow.
Yeah. All right. So we can come back to that if we want. The next one is the thorns. And so here again, other seed fell among the thorns, which they grew up and choked the plants. And doesn't say much more about that. So, okay, so we talked a lot about thorns in the fairy tales too.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, I
The
have a new
thorns-
appreciation for thorns.
Yeah, me too. So the thorns are the lowest. In terms of what grows organically, thorns are the last thing you want. The thorns are the lowest. Things like fruit trees would be the highest form of vegetation or something like that. So
Yeah.
It's interesting that this idea of thorns, then the thorns will choke out any kind of new growth that's happening.
Yeah, but to contrast it with the birds come from above and the thorns come from below.
That's right.
And so so it's kind of this, you can get taken by either extreme. I like that word. I like the idea that it says that it chokes it out, because I think I've mentioned this in another podcast, but the word worry stems from a Germanic word that means to choke. That's what that word literally means. And you start to thinking about worries in our life, or when you're anxious about something, it is that choking feeling. It doesn't allow, again, these transformative ideas to take root because you're always worried about all the little thorns in life, right?
And I think when he explains this parable, he actually says, the thorns are all the concerns of life. You can think of a time where, my wife works a lot of weekends, so sometimes it's like, man, I'm going to spend Saturday reading and writing and working on navigating ancient faith stuff, but then I start mowing the lawn and, a couple things I need to do around the house, pay a couple bills, and, I had good intentions of really nurturing my soul.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And then it's just like all the thorns. And in that case, you want to minimize the thorns, but some are necessary, right?
Yeah, it's almost like you can't ignore them completely because I don't know. I mean, they're a reality of this world. So it's not that we completely ignore it, but it's just that we don't give them an elevated place. Keep them where they're supposed to be, the lowest, right? Keep it on the down low.
No, I was sitting there thinking, I'm like, okay, the thorns belong outside of the rock boundary of the field. Like there's going to be thorns out there, right? And so,
yeah,
you've got to go deal with them every now and then, but they shouldn't inhabit the space of growth.
Yeah.
Right. Your heart, your mind, right?
Right.
There are things you have to take care of. So I don't know. There's something about that idea of the tended field, the rocks have formed the boundary, the thorns are outside. That's the key to a well-nurtured soul or something like that.
Yeah, I'd say that's probably right. There's also an aspect of thorns that maybe I'll use the word weeds because it's hard to tell if you've got weeds or if I'm not a gardener, so I have planted a few things and I'll see something pop up and think, oh, here we go. Got some growth. And it turns out it's a weed. But it's, so it's hard to tell the difference between new growth and a weed. Now, obviously, after time and it takes root and you got a nice rose bush or something there, then you can distinguish the difference. But initially, it's hard to tell the difference between the thorn and the actual new growth itself. And so there's some kind of, I don't know, I was thinking there's something about distinguishing substance from the noise, and that's kind of what the thorns represent. And I don't want to get off on a tangent about the anxiety of this generation, but we just finished 2025 and all the recaps of the news headlines of the year. At the end of the year they're always say, here are the big stories. I saw a couple of those stories about the recap of 2025, and most of the top stories were either divisive or just grim, right? And there's just a symptom of, like I said, noise rather than substance. And when I was watching that, I'm sitting there thinking, I didn't think of it at the time, I'm thinking it now. Yeah, that was all thorns. It was all just thorns.
Yeah.
Like, how do you, is there something to separating the thorns from, or the weeds from the grass or something like that? We'll get into this more about the wheat and the tares.
Yeah.
But there is something about thorns look appropriate initially until established growth is coming along. And then you can tell them apart easy. But at the beginning, it's hard to separate the noise and substance.
Yeah, and you're right. And that's going to get to the whole next parable here. But, so the other thing about thorns is we were talking, thorns can also be a protective hedge. So in Snow White, the thorns actually protect Snow White and the castle from outsiders.
Right.
Right. So there again, it's almost like the rocks. It's like these things have their place, right? You have to live your life. You have to pay your bills.
Yeah.
But do they occupy the central space, or can they form a boundary? And so it allows what's good and nurturing in, and it keeps harmful things out.
Yeah.
Right? If you pay your bills, harmful bill collectors aren't going to come knocking on
Right.
your door, right?
Yeah.
Right? So
that's a good way to think about
idea.
it. Right. No, I think you're right. It's easy to read this parable and say, well, thorns are bad, rocks are bad. And that's not what it's saying. Thorns and rocks have their place in the natural world. It's
right.
What has your attention? What is it that you're focused on? Are you focused on the rocks? Are you focused on the thorns? Because that's not going to be a nurturing environment. And this is why people are so concerned over the constant battle for our attention, right? And the fact that we don't create any space for thinking about, I don't know, just deeper ideas. Taking a shower, I think, is about the only waking time that we have that we're not captured by headphones or a screen. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
we need to create that space, and here we are on a podcast with our headphones on, looking at our screens. But yeah, I think it is something in that message that's saying you need to create a space, a quiet space where ideas can nurture. And in this attention grabbing culture that we're in right now, it's tough to find that.
Yeah. It's a lot of work. And look, maybe that's Jesus' point is, to have a healthy producing field, it's not an easy thing. You have to be very intentional about it, right?
Yeah.
The elements
Yep.
have to serve their purpose and be in their place, the rocks, the thorns. But if you don't have any organization or structure around that, it's just going to be a field of rocks and weeds. That's all it's going to be.
Yeah, when you jumble it all up, it's like figure out where these things go and their
Yeah.
place, and that creates nurturing soil. Yeah.
All right, so then we get to the good soil. And Jesus says, this is the person who hears and understands. Now, it's also interesting because he said, where it produces a crop 160, 30 times what was sown. And I don't know, I started out this year reading some Stoic classics again, Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, just to kind of go, well, that's probably a good way to start. And I was just reminded about how you can't control the outcomes. You can only control what you produce. You can only
Right.
control what you put into it. You use the example of you can shoot the arrow. You can do all this training about shooting an arrow, but ultimately you can't control whether the wind changes or something hits it, or whether it hits the target. So that's a very Stoic idea, and I just thought it was interesting that at the end, Jesus is saying it produces 100 or 60 or 30-fold. I think what he's saying there is something similar. Like ultimately, you can't control what is produced.
Yeah, I think you
Does
may
that make
be right.
sense?
Yeah, you can control the rocks, the thorns. You put them in their place. But some fields are going to produce whatever tenfold, and some are going to produce 100-fold. And so it's almost like he's saying, don't try to attach a rigid formula to this. You know what I mean? You can only control what
Yeah.
you can control,
Yeah, do your part, nurture your part, but don't attach a lot of value to, it's the nature of the seed too, right? Don't attach a lot of value to results. And especially, I think, getting into the comparison of your results with other people.
Yeah, I think you're right. And this is, I don't know, this is just such a great parable because it really can apply to so many other arenas of our understanding, that what this story is asking us is, are you the type of person that's open to hearing new ideas, or is your thinking rigid and absolute in a way that doesn't allow any real development outside of your calcified opinions, right? And this is a grumpy old man problem, There are areas of my thinking, you know what I mean, that are susceptible to this type of roadblock. And what this story helped me see is that, I've got to be open to new ideas and not have such rigid opinions, or else transformation can't take root. And all of us have kind of experienced maybe transformational moments or periods in our lives, but it's hard to sustain that. And I think what this parable is saying is, if you want sustained transformation, you have to constantly be getting rid of the rocks, getting rid of the thorns. And it's something, it's a constant thing. And that's what you said a minute ago about being intentional. It's a very intentional act that is, I don't know, it's going to take a lot of energy on our part, but it's also, to your point about the Stoic thinking, is you do your part and then let the growth happen organically, happen naturally.
Yeah, I think that's right. And if you're not seeing any kind of transformation, if you're not seeing kind of the kingdom of God developing around you, so to speak, then it's time to take a look at the field that you're tending to, right? Is it a mess?
Yeah, right.
And chances are it is. Chances are,
Yeah.
It's full of distraction. It's full of noise. It's full of social media. And it's no, I'm going to harp on social media. But
Man.
it's no wonder that you don't see any of that growth taking place.
Right. It kind of teaches me that the kingdom of God is clearly more organic and complex than what is often presented, right? that the gospel is looking for an opening in our thinking to be able to grow over time and take root in our lives. And it kind of goes against that idea that there's a quote unquote, there's a moment that you gave your life to Christ, right? That we were raised to kind of believe. And it points more toward the ongoing need for your heart and mind to be open and fertile and for slow, continual depth of understanding to take place.
Yeah, yeah. We have a little raised garden, and I'm going to try to resist continually bringing it up because I've actually learned a lot from tending to that little raised garden, trying to grow tomatoes and basil and jalapeno peppers, things like that. But for the first year, we couldn't grow anything. Put soil in there, we planted seeds, nothing. And the second year, we didn't get much, but I've continued to, pull the little weeds. I continue to throw sometimes my coffee grounds in there, eggshells. Sometimes if I had a banana, I'll throw the banana peel in there. And, and lo and behold, like last year, some of the tomatoes, we didn't even plant anything, but some of the tomatoes that had fallen off from the previous season started growing. I mean, we had like 3 huge tomato plants.
Oh, that's cool.
And yeah. And
from previous
they just
seasons.
Came back. Yeah, from previous season. And they just came back now. I mean, I have 2 tomato plants, and this one has big clusters. They're still green, but I didn't plant them.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I think about that idea of, you have to nurture your environment. You have to nurture your soul. And the kingdom of heaven is there as a seed containing all this potential, but you don't know when it's going to start sprouting.
Yeah.
But you have to keep nurturing it. And you can't control the harvest.
Yeah.
Right? Now you can do your part, but you can't control what it's all going to produce because actually that's another nature of the seed is, this is going to yield tomatoes, but you don't know how many.
Yeah, I think you're right that we try to apply this formulaic idea to the gospel, and this parable pushes back on that type of thinking. Yeah, well, we can move on, but you and I have talked about how somebody will come up with a really neat transformative idea in the church, and the first thing we want to do is write a book and create a small group series and package it, right? Package it, reproduce it, and send it out. And I think you're right. I think when we do that, there's nothing wrong with some of that, but at the same time, it's just maybe we'd get frustrated that we don't have the same transformative effects of the original project, so to speak, right?
Yeah. All right. So one of the cool things that I think we'll see in this series is how some of these start to play into each other. So we already hit on this a little bit, but the next one, if you're continuing on in Matthew chapter 13, is in Matthew 13:24 through 30 is the weeds among the wheat. And that's a little bit longer too, so I guess we'll let people listen to it and then we can come back and talk about it.
Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you are pulling the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time, I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned, then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn."
Okay, so this was a little bit different. We have that same kind of metaphor where we got growth and seeds and things like that, but in this case, we've got wheat growing amongst the tares, depending on your translation. The weeds are growing in the wheat, right? And they're going to have to coexist. This is kind of a strange one. They're going to have to coexist until the judgment day, of which, and he talks about cutting it down and the wheat gets thrown in the good pile and the tares get burned up, right?
Yeah.
So this is kind of an interesting one because it's clearly letting us know that if you're looking for some sort of cosmic justice in this earthly life, then you're bound to be frustrated and angry about all the injustices that are never ending, right? And so this kind of addresses this problem.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in this one. Again, not to jump to what I took from this, but yeah, I think there's that going on. I think it dismisses this idea of being an isolationist, right? If we could just all
Okay,
retreat,
yeah.
if we can just barrier ourselves out from the outside world, if we could all retreat from, I was just watching this thing about if we could have a Christian commune, everything would be perfect. The answer is no, it wouldn't, right?
Right.
But it kind of pushes it back against that idea because Jesus is clearly saying that, again, the kingdom of heaven for a while is going to have to coexist along, well, evil. I think he actually says that when he explains this one too. Okay, well, I think when Jesus actually explains this one, or maybe he says it, he talks about the evil one sowing weeds among the wheat, right?
Right.
Just a couple of things that's going on there. First of all, I think, especially today, we don't do ourselves much good about thinking of categorizing people as evil or good. I think
Yeah.
it's probably better to think about ideas and movements and ideologies.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I went with this one. And one of the things that we talked about earlier that you brought up is this idea that initially these things grow side by side and you can't tell the difference.
Right.
Right? That's the nature of this idea of a tare is it looks like wheat until it's time for the wheat to come to fruition. And there's that root word of fruit, right? Literally when the wheat starts to fruit and these things growing alongside it don't ever fruit. They don't produce anything.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I'm glad you said that you clarified that it's easy to say, well, this is the saved and the unsaved. But I think it may be better to see this as ideas, like you said, because, yeah, there's something about letting an idea take root, but then it doesn't go anywhere. And I mean, I think we all deal with this. We're in the world of information. There's constantly new ideas and interesting conspiracies. I love all this stuff, right? So there's these cool conspiracies coming at you, and you're like, oh man, I wonder if there's something to that, But after a while, it's almost like you have to say, I don't know. I don't know what about this or that conspiracy, but because there's no fruit coming from it. There's nothing I can do about it if it's true, and you just got to move on from it. And I think you're right. I think that's the way you tell the distinction between a healthy idea and a bad idea is what does it produce? Does it produce anything of value? Yeah, and I think we see that a lot with protests and with some of the things we're seeing in the headlines of the past 10 years or so, that initially it's like, oh, this is interesting. There's this protest going on, no kings. There's a no kings protest, and there's a lot of noise around it. But then at the end of it, and not to get political, we try to stay politically neutral. But at the end of that's a particular one where at the end of it, it's like, okay, no kings. We don't have a king, and I guess we're clarifying that we don't want one. But it kind of reminds me of every once in a while you'll see somebody do something gimmicky, like they'll walk across the entire United States, or they'll swim some real long body of water. And when the news gets a hold of it and they interview the person, they're like, hey, why are you doing this? And they'll say something like, oh, I'm trying to raise awareness for breast cancer, or I'm trying to raise awareness about mental illness. And I always hear those, like when I hear that word awareness, I'm thinking, yeah, we were aware. I mean, I kind of knew that breast cancer was a thing. And so, I guess it's trying to attach an honorable thing to your little gimmick thing of eating this many hot dogs or something, whatever the gimmick is, right? And what I'm trying to say is that's an example of one of those things that you're like, oh, that sounds interesting, and oh, that's cool. They're trying to raise awareness for this. But at the end of the day, you're like, okay, I guess that was it. There's really nothing to be done with it. There's no fruit at the end of it.
Yeah.
Does that make any sense?
Yeah, because Jesus, look, he taught a lot about, and not even in parables, but he said, you'll know people by the fruit they bear. Good trees produce good fruit. I mean, he says that several places, right?
Right.
And so when you tie it back to this idea then of the parable, that here is I guess wheat isn't technically a fruit plant, but, here's something that's meant to bear fruit. And then there's
Valuable,
all
yeah.
this stuff that looks like it that doesn't. To me, that's what he's talking about. Okay, so here's where I went with this too is in recent years, there's been a lot of things that look like good ideas, and everyone jumps on board, right?
Yeah.
They go viral,
Yeah.
and a lot of people start virtue signaling about, hey, I'm going to do this. I'm going to put this background on my profile and things like that. But they don't produce any fruit. And
Yeah.
I just,
Yeah.
to me, what this actually did was it told me to pay more attention to what is bearing fruit and what isn't. And don't just jump on every bandwagon, that's the outrage of the moment. And is it
Yeah.
producing any fruit? And also, where did it originate? Because I've seen, again, people of faith follow terrible ideas from awful people
Right.
because it had this kind of brief, correspondence with something Jesus might have said, if you take it this one way. And I just go, man, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
But there again, I think this idea of like the evil one is sowing ideas that look good, but they don't produce fruit.
Right.
And we have to be more aware of that.
Okay, so what does it mean to produce fruit then? Because that's easy to say, but what is like in our understanding of this, what does fruit mean?
Okay,
Does
so,
does that make sense?
it does. And if you look at the other teachings of Jesus, teach what's nourishing.
Yeah.
A lot of times fruit is compared to like the fruit of the Spirit. Apostle Paul talks about that, virtue. All right.
Mhm.
So it's actually like a movement that's producing fruit is actually producing virtuous people among its followers.
Yeah.
And in the case of wheat actually is producing more seed. So, okay,
Yeah.
so that gets to this idea then that something that is fruitful is actually producing more potential and more fruit. Something that
Yep.
is not, and we've talked about this previously, the nature of evil is it's not productive.
Right.
It only consumes, right?
That's all it can do. Right.
That's all it can do.
Yeah.
And so I think that plays into this as well. I don't know. That's a long answer to your question, but
No, I think that's what I was getting at. It's like, well, it's easy to say, does it produce fruit? But what does that even mean? And I know we kind of have these ideas of what that means, but when you talked about the fruits of the Spirit, one thing I have thought about before when it comes to the fruits of the Spirit is that the fruit is not actually a benefit to the tree. Do you know what I'm saying? Like you can have a tree that doesn't
Yeah.
produce any fruit and it's a perfectly healthy tree, right? And so in that context, you know that you're producing fruit when other people are coming to that tree to pick the fruit. That other people find value in it. And so that's another, yes, I like the idea of the fact that it's reproducible and you're going to see this reproduce in an organic way like a seed. But you're going to have people outside of you coming to you or your church or your group or whatever, and they're going to be nourished from the actions that you're perpetuating.
yeah. It's reproducible. So the fruit contains more seed.
Right.
So it's something that's just going to keep producing virtuous people, good ideas, good results. But tying it back to the other one, it's like we don't always control the harvest of it, right? 160, 30, but it's producing something. And I don't know. It's just something that evil doesn't do that. And I'm becoming more aware of that in recent months is evil doesn't do that. Evil or bad ideas, it's not even just say evil, but bad ideas don't produce anything. They sound good, but in the end, it's the same old, same old. So one of the difficulties of talking about these parables is once you start, and we saw this in fairy tales as well, right? A thorn in one fairy tale represents a thorn in another fairy tale, right?
Yeah.
The forest always represents the same thing. And so one of the things that when you understand that with parables is that it's hard to talk about these in isolation, I'm finding. And I think that's similar, because it's hard to talk about one and then say, okay, that links to the one we just talked about. That links to the one we're going to talk about in a minute. Because this idea, the seed always means the same thing, or usually always means the same thing. So I don't know. We can move on, but that's just occurred to me that that's some of the good and the bad of trying to talk about these is there's a lot more in the single parable once you realize that I think Jesus told 40 parables,
Right.
right?
And the image that he chooses is not the same image, but it's you're right. When you reuse some of these different images, they usually mean the same thing.
Right.
So the next parable that we go on to is the mustard seed. And I just said to you before the podcast, saying, man, we probably should have started with this one, right? Because we really could have unpacked this idea of the seed by itself, because Jesus ends with it, and it really does get into this idea that small things, the packaged potential idea. And so I don't know what's your thought about the mustard seed that we kind of haven't already talked about.
Let me read it real quick.
Yeah.
He told him another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field. Though it is the smallest of all seeds, yet when it grows, it's the largest of garden plants and becomes a tree so that the birds come and perch on its branches. Okay, so that's pretty simple, right?
Yeah.
It would have been a good place to start because it's the same idea that all the potential is contained in this little seed, right? And he's
Yeah.
probably I haven't planted mustard, so I can't say I know, but apparently it's
Apparently it's a
seed.
tiny little seed. Yeah, that's right.
And
Like a grain of
grows into a
sand
very
type thing.
huge, grows into a
Right.
very huge plant, which I just realized he talks about the birds. So there's that idea the birds come and perch in it. I don't know what to do with that, but
Oh
we
no,
talked about
that's a
that
cool
earlier.
that's a cool concept. Yeah, I want to run with that. Yeah, the heavenly ideas have a place to land.
Yeah, that they have this place to land on this growing potential or
Right.
something like that. I don't know. Well, obviously I think one of the things he's saying is the kingdom of heaven initially appears as almost this insignificant thing, right? But
Right.
over the course of the last 2,000 years, it's grown to support a huge amount, millions and millions, probably if not billions of the population,
Right.
right? So I don't know. It's something like that. But where do you think he's going with this idea of a mustard seed?
No, I think you said it right. It's just that you're right. It starts out small, but again, over time, slowly, it turns into something. The potential is almost endless because it's reproducible, because it's recreatable.
Yeah.
I just think it's interesting that all three of these are about harvest, are about the seed. There's the seed aspect of it. And I just like that he has this thread through all three of these parables. It's pointing to potential that that can just be never ending, essentially. And so I don't know.
We'd say exponential growth or something like that.
Yeah. There's an exponential aspect to it. And to your point, that this obviously started 2,000 years ago and is now this worldwide phenomenon. Doesn't seem like the right word, but you know what I'm saying, right? This worldwide thing, right? That has changed so many people and transformed so many people's lives. It's like, it started out from such a simple idea, and he's basically saying that if your own life is open to new ideas, that those types of things, the kingdom of God, can be manifest if you allow your own heart to be fertile and to let things grow and to not be so rigid. And this amazing thing can come out of that.
The other thing that just occurred to me as I was reading that again is, he says a man tended his field, right? A man took and planted in his field. And so here's a person who's actually doing the right thing. He's tending his field, right? And so it's almost like he can take the most insignificant of seed and he's going to grow this big plant. And now instead of the birds snatching the seed off the path, the birds come and perch in these beautiful plants that he's got growing. Because it's almost like the full picture of someone who's doing this the right way.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think there's something about the image of virtue doesn't just pop up in some people. It has to be nurtured.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's a rabbit trail. Do you think that the curse of Adam having to work the ground and till it to bring forth a harvest is tied to this idea in some way? Is it a way of saying that before the fall, that all creation was sort of self-evident in its justice and goodness, right? And we didn't have to dig and struggle to make sense of the world. Is there
In the
something?
garden.
Yeah, because before the fall, creation appears to be pretty intelligible, right? Its goodness and its order, in a sense, are obvious, right? Adam names the animals, maybe not as an act of dominion, but as an act of recognition. You know what I'm saying? It's like meaning is close at hand, right? He just has to name it. You don't have to excavate reality to find out what's true. It just presents itself before the fall. And after the fall, that clarity fractures, right? And now meaning has to be extracted. Truth has to be worked for. Is that going anywhere with you? I don't know. I'm
No,
kind of just,
no, it
that's bouncing
actually
around my head.
it actually is, because once you say it like that, and there's a lot of references in here to the Garden of Eden versus the fallen world after sin was introduced. And
Right.
so I think you might be onto something, that you could listen to all these parables, especially back to back to back, right?
Right.
And go, wow, he's describing the contrast between the Garden of Eden, where you might say virtue did just kind of spring up naturally, and the fallen world we live in, that the kingdom of heaven is going to have to break through. And you have all of these things, right? So you're going to have to nurture virtue now, right? You're going to have to till the ground with your hands to get
Yeah.
anything to produce. And even the
Yeah.
idea of thorns, right? Thorns grew outside of Eden. The ground
Right.
is going to produce thorns. And so
Yeah.
Jesus is bringing these elements of the thorns, because, like, we live in the non-Edenic world, right?
Yeah.
So I do think these are subtle references back to, maybe it's just the reminder that, hey, we don't live in Eden, and the kingdom of
Right.
God is coming, but you have to be aware we live in a fallen world. And if you're paying attention, maybe you do see that correlation back to creation and the fall and the resulting world that we now live in, right? And
Yeah.
have to get
Yeah.
buy-in.
No, I think this is interesting. I think this is going somewhere, because we always take a real literal reading of the Genesis account. And you and I have kind of said, well, maybe the earth wasn't made in 24-hour days. You know what I mean? That type of thing. But when we get to the garden and what Adam's job was, we suddenly go back to this literal reading of, yeah, it was just fruit trees just popped up everywhere and just fell in his hand, and he ate it, and now it's not going to be that way anymore. It's going to be more difficult. But I almost think that there's something to that it's more like meaning was obvious, truth was obvious, and now it has to be worked for. Yeah. Okay. So again, Jesus is talking to the Pharisees, and they had this rigid ideology that had emerged from the law, right? And Paul talks about, I'm sorry, Jesus talks about, I haven't come to abolish the law. I haven't come to get rid of it. I have come to fulfill it, to kind of present it in a different way, maybe you could look at it. And so in that sense, these rigid absolutes can be seen, going back to our Adam conversation, as sort of a post-fall coping mechanism, right? They're attempts to turn living soil into stable, predictable, unmoving stones, right? But the problem is that the stone doesn't grow anything. So it had its time, because we had to have that stability and that rigidity. You had to have that boundary that you talk about, but you can't turn living soil into an unmovable stone and get anything from it. And so that's where I'm starting to see this transformation from the law to what Jesus is preaching. And this is why it was so dangerous, and so, like, the Pharisees just lost their mind over this stuff, because the more they understood, the more he spoke in these parables, and the more the Pharisees went back and discussed it in the temple and said, here's what he's saying. You realize what he's saying? Man, it was scandalous. It was a big deal. And I really can start to see this now, even in these early parables, what the Pharisees think that he's undermining, but he's really just trying to complete. Did that go anywhere? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, a lot of these, we'll see this more in some of the other upcoming episodes. But a lot of these references are actually subtle references to Old Testament imagery. So the field, Jesus says the field is the world, right? Israelites would see the field as Israel. And Jesus is
Okay.
basically saying,
Hold up.
yeah, it's not being very productive. It's full of rocks. It's full of thorns. And it's that idea of trying to nurture the garden of Eden as much as you can, but you're going to have to deal with the curse of the thorns and the weeds and the birds, right? The fallen,
Right.
the
Yeah,
fallen
the new
coming
reality.
down, which again,
Yep.
you could talk about the Nephilim and all that stuff. So, I mean, I actually think some of that imagery is there. But there are definitely cases where people would see the field as Israel and the law is the boundary,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
Jesus is saying that's not enough, right? The fence needs to be repaired, but you're preparing the field to grow something new, something better,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I think the religious impulse after the fall, it says something like, if we just define things clearly enough, we can fix the world. And what Jesus is seeming to say is the world is healed by something alive and patiently working from within, right? And that's why
Yeah.
he was that's why he had that countercultural message, basically.
Yeah. So that whole idea of confronting the Pharisees and a small thing working its way through kind of leads to the last one that we're going to talk about today is Matthew 13:33, where he says one more. He told them still another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into about 60 pounds of flour, huge amount, until it worked all through the dough. And like that's the parable.
Yeah, right. Yeah, this is a cool one because it seems to take a left-hand turn. You're like, what? I thought we were talking about harvest, but if you think about it, this really does fit perfectly with our soil framework. That yeast doesn't sit on top of the dough. It's not, it disappears, right? It just mixes in. But once it's properly integrated, let's say, it quietly transforms everything from the inside out, right? I think that's how it ties in a little bit to our soil framework.
Yeah, in some ways, you could say that yeast is just another variation of the seed, right?
Yeah.
But it's truly more organic. We don't work with yeast that much. I know in COVID, everyone had their sourdough starters, but
Sourdough. Yeah, my daughter's all into it.
yeah, but we don't generally have like yeast sitting around, starting making bread. Some people might, but yeah, I think it's actually, isn't it like an organism?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a living organism that
Yeah, so it's a living
as
thing.
it yeah, I'm gonna make a fool of myself, but I think as it consumes something like starch that it outgasses something, and that's what makes it kind of
sugars or something. Yeah.
something like that. Anyway, don't
But
get me
anyway,
going.
the nature of yeast is that, once it's worked into a dough, I like the word integrated because you can't pick the yeast out. You can't give it to your kid and your kid says, "Hey, I don't like yeast.
I don't
Will you
like
pick
yeast."
it out."
Right.
You're like,
Yeah.
well, you're eating this or nothing, right? Because the yeast is there.
Yeah. And it transforms everything. I mean, it
And
changes
yeah.
everything about it, right? I mean,
Yeah, so maybe this is kind of one-upping the imagery of the seed. It's like, okay, if
Yeah.
you're blown away with this seed, like the kingdom of heaven is like yeast, and it's going to just go through everything and transform everything.
it's almost like he's saying, "Are my bakers in the house? I've thrown the knowledge to the farmers. Now where are my bakers? Here we go. Let's do
Silas,
this again. Let's try this
You
again."
make a mean sourdough. This one's for you, right?
Yeah, this was for you, dude. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, it is, but it is neat because it really does hold on to that framework, even though it feels like it deviates from the original first three parables there,
Yeah.
But it actually just kind of extends the idea on a little bit deeper level, maybe.
Yeah, and one thing that's interesting about yeast is normally in a lot of Jesus's teaching, yeast is actually portrayed as a negative thing. And it goes back to the whole Old Testament where they had to make unleavened bread, right? Because when they were traveling through the Exodus, they didn't have yeast, so their bread was unleavened. Okay,
Yeah.
so in a lot of the festivals, yeast was, I don't want to say discouraged or outlawed. Yeast wasn't allowed. You had to bake unleavened bread.
Right.
So,
Right. Just like they did in the wilderness.
yeah, and so yeast in a lot of cases has this negative connotation to it, right? And in fact,
Yeah.
elsewhere Jesus says, "Be on your guard against the yeast of the Sadducees and the Pharisees."
Yeah.
But there's still that principle there. So one way to think about it is a bad idea can be just as invasive as a good idea. That's why you have to be careful about what
Yeah,
you're
yeah, yeah,
nurturing.
yeah. So it goes back to that idea, the idea of ideas again. No, that's a
Yeah,
cool thought. So what he's saying is the mechanism is neutral, right? And what matters is what you introduce into the system, right? In that way,
yeah,
both good and
yeah,
evil spread the same way. That's cool. Yeah, I like that. That's neat.
yeah. Any other thoughts on that idea of yeast and this really simple parable?
Well, I like that you pointed out that it's typically spoken in a negative context, but he's sort of just saying again, this is how ideas spread. And so obviously if you allow the weeds to grow up in your garden, then that's what's going to come out of it. That's those are bad ideas. And I think that actually helps it helps point out because there is a tendency to go back to the wheat and the tares, to sort of read that as the saved and the unsaved. And I'm not saying that it's not about that at all, but I am saying the yeast kind of helps clarify that maybe it is more about the growth of bad ideas, or good and bad ideas. You know what I'm saying? Like they both
Yeah,
spread the same way, I think is what he's saying, as opposed to trying to point out, the sheep from the goats, let's say, right? That we kind
yeah,
of tend to want to do. Who's on the inside? Who's on the outside? He's not talking about me, man. He's talking about you. You know,
yeah,
you're the tares. I'm not a tear. You're a tear, right? It's like, but if you take this to the level of ideas, I don't know. I just think it takes on a little bit different meaning.
and how we started is we so want to reduce this, that reductionistic idea of we want to reduce this to, well, didn't Jesus say that's what that means? Well, yes, he did. But when you understand the story that he's telling, it means
Hmm.
so much more than that. And that's why you have to hang on to the story. Because if you just
Right.
say, okay, the wheat and the tares, it's the saved and the unsaved. I'm saved, so I'm good. So I got it. And it's like, no, you're just
Yeah.
scratching the surface, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. No, that's interesting.
Yeah, okay. So we covered a lot today. We're just in Matthew 13, but I don't know. Any last thoughts about what this is getting at with the nature of the kingdom of God, what Jesus is trying to convey to people?
Yeah, I'll tell you what, this is one of those episodes that I'm going to be thinking about for several days after we record it, obviously. But yeah, maybe one last thing I want to point out, and I hope it's kind of been evident in this opening episode, is that you don't master a parable. You kind of you sit under it, right? You chew on it and let it sink in. And so we don't want to get in the mindset of saying, this is exactly what this story means and move on, right? So we encourage our listeners to read these parables for themselves and to let them do the work that great stories do, right? That is, let it attach to your particular way of thinking and your individual experience, because these stories are very layered and can be incredibly personal if you let them be, right?
Yeah,
And so
yeah,
that's what we're trying to do. Again, is I just don't want to give the impression that we wrap that up. We said exactly what that means. One of the things that I pulled from this episode is it's a very individual. It's your individual heart, the way it receives it. And so your heart may receive a parable differently than my heart. And it doesn't mean that you can translate it any old way you want, but it does mean that there is going to be an individual aspect to that. And so, yeah, I just encourage people not to, after this podcast, read some of these parables and just chew on it all day long. Think about it all day, because that's when that transformation actually takes place, and not being distracted by all the things of the world and just reading it and moving on because it's a verse of the day type thing, right?
yeah.
Hold on to it and see what it does and let it do its transformation inside you.
Well, and my final thought is kind of along those same lines that I would say is these parables, this is what people did back at that time. They made bread, they tended fields, they harvested, right?
Yeah.
And so I think Jesus is one of the things he's saying is the kingdom of God, if you're paying attention, will be seen among the ordinary things in your life if you will elevate it and give them meaning. And
Yeah.
so, in the same way, it's like read these parables, and I don't know, think about when you're making dinner. How is the kingdom of God like making dinner, right? How is the kingdom of God? And that may sound silly, but look,
No,
that's
it's
no
not.
different from what Jesus is doing, right?
Yeah.
How is the kingdom of God like, raising your toddlers, right? How is the kingdom of God like whatever you do, right? Sitting
Right.
on your commute to work. How is the kingdom of God like that? And I think that's what Jesus is trying to do. He's trying to connect the potential of the kingdom of God so that people could see it and recognize it in all that they did.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. It's not Jesus giving answers. It's him shaping how we see. I don't know, giving us glasses on how to view the world. And to your point, you can see it in all the little things that you do day in and day out if you're open and not distracted, and if you have a heart that is trying to seek out these things.
Yeah. Well, that was just the first episode. So
Golly, man, dude. Well, I didn't mean to get off. I got off on a few tangents on that one, but this was a really, really good one, and it just kind of, I don't know, it lit a spark in me. Okay, so next episode, where we taking this parable thing?
So there's a whole bunch of parables that Jesus talks about. The kingdom of heaven is this very hidden thing. So we're going to talk about parables that kind of reveal hidden knowledge and why it's hidden and secretive in the first place. So
elusus. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, a little bit different take.
That'll be fun. All right. Sounds good.
Yeah, and the last thing I would say is one of the easiest ways to get a hold of us is there is a link under the show notes. The very first thing you see is you can just text us real quick, shoot us a message. The warning with that is that we can't respond to it. So if you want to reach us, there's also email address in the show notes. But I was just reminded of that because someone actually texted us this week. We got an email, a really kind,
real
really
cool comment.
They really enjoyed one of the episodes that we had done, and they really liked the podcast. So love to hear from people. Encourage you to use that link, but if you do use that link, we can't respond directly back to you. So if you want a response, email.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds good.
So we'll pick this up next episode.
All right, we'll see you in the next episode. Thanks for listening. We hope this conversation gave you a fresh way of seeing these ancient stories and maybe even a new way of seeing your own life. If this episode was helpful, feel free to share it with someone you think would enjoy it. You can also find more episodes and resources at Navigating an Ancient Faith. Until next time, keep paying attention, and we'll see you in the next episode.